let me ask y'all this before we, when it comes to religion and faith and belief, everybody is a narcissist. Everybody believes that they're true. Let me ask y'all this before we get to that point. Stick a pin in that. Let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of a concrete truth or absolute truth?
Right. Yeah.
You know what that is?
Yeah.
This is something that can't be debated, disputed, or argued against. We can all agree that ice is cold.
Right.
That anywhere on earth, you could be in the middle of a desert, but if you bring water to what we understand to be 0 degrees Celsius, it's gonna freeze.
Oh.
Can't argue against that. That's anywhere on earth. We can all agree that fire is hot.
Definitely can agree.
That if I set your ass on fire and let you just cook and burn, it's a good chance that you're gonna burn to death.
For sure.
That anywhere on earth, in the Antarctica, if you put fire to water at what we understand to be 100 degrees Celsius, that water is gonna boil.
For sure.
Gonna come to a boil. You can't dispute it. You got a car that runs on petroleum, gasoline. If that is completely no gas in this car whatsoever, we can all agree that this car is not gonna start and damn sure ain't gonna move. We can all agree like these are absolute truths.
Yeah.
Can't say the thing about God and religion. So how can what you believe and what you telling me, how is that an absolute truth?
All right.
I think when it comes to these, you have anything you want to say before I go into it on this?
Nah.
So when it comes to these kind of conversations, he goes, everybody's a narcissist about religion. I get what he's saying. I think there is some narcissism in it, but I think I would define the narcissism in religious and or spiritual conversations, even philosophical conversations, a little bit differently than most people. Most people, when they hear that people believe what they think is true, is absolutely true, they go, that's a narcissist. How can you say when there's so many different beliefs out there that yours is the true one? Now, that's a fallacious way of looking at it. Just because there's a bunch of different versions doesn't mean that you're wrong for standing on a particular truth. Again, that would be like there's a car crash that happens and the cop goes to the scene of the crime and interviews people that are there. Sorry, the scene of the crash and interviews people that are there, and he gets slightly different variations of what happened. Just because there's different versions doesn't mean there isn't a truth. And that doesn't mean that one of the people that are there one of the people that are there that are present when it happened and there with the cop, that doesn't mean that they may not be stating it accurately just because there's different versions. So imagine that cop goes, since there's, okay, who knows what really happened? And there's 6 people there, right? And those 6 people say, I know what happens. And he interviews them all individually. And they all have slightly varying stories, right? And then when he brings them all back together, he's like, hey, look, y'all, I've been able to listen to all of y'all. Y'all are all narcissists. Why? Because y'all have 6 different versions of the story, yet each of you believes that you have the truth. That would be ridiculous, because just because there's 6 different variations of the story doesn't mean one of them can't be true. It means all of them can't be true because it's contradictory, but one of them can be the truth. And oftentimes one of them is closer to the truth. Maybe there's a camera that validates what one person says more than the rest. I mean, all of them are probably really close, maybe 80%, 70%, 90%. And one other person has it pretty spot on for whatever the reason. So it's fallacious to say just because there's different perspectives on a particular situation that to think that you have the truth makes you narcissistic. Now, what I will say is this, a narcissistic aspect of it is when you think that your way is right and you're not open to any type of conversation about it, any type of inquiry, anything like that. I think a good example of that is if you interact with Jehovah's Witnesses, they pass out literature, they go out, they knock on doors, but they will not accept any literature from anybody else. To me, that's narcissistic because you're willing to share and you give the guise of being open to conversation and wanting to have dialogue and discourse on important matters, but you're only willing to give and not take. Now, to me, that's narcissistic because you're putting your own self above everybody else and you're putting yourself on a higher plane. You have an inflated view of yourself, and we're all fallible. And that's put to his point when he talks about the absoluteness that people tend to hold on to or think that they have. And he was comparing it to ice melting and fire being hot, which I'll get into here shortly. But I think on the deeper level, he is right that people tend to be a little narcissistic about their perspectives, religious or not, just in general, whether it's about sports, it's about politics, whatever it is. And you see them start to get angry when you start to question their assumptions that they bring to the table. So when you have certain assumptions, things that you can't justify completely, things that you're not totally sure about, but if you're making these absolute statements about it and you're unwilling to question those things, yeah, there's definitely a level of narcissism. There's a low empathy. You want the person to listen to you, but you don't listen to them, those kind of things. But just believing that your way is the absolute truth, that's not narcissistic, just because there's other versions of the truth out there, other people that claim to have the truth. Even though that may seem like it makes sense, it's not logically a coherent way of viewing it. Because there is a truth. They've done various studies, and I won't get into those studies, where they'll have actors in a room and they'll ask a question. And then there's one person who's not an actor, and the actors will raise their hand for the lie, just to see if the one person who's really there and doesn't know what's going on is going to go with the lie or stick with the truth. So they start second guessing themselves, going, I thought I saw that, but if everybody else didn't see it, did I really see it? That's a psychological phenomenon. But just because they have a different perspective doesn't mean that person's perspective that is not the actor in that experiment doesn't understand what really happened. And on a psychological level, those things can play a role, but logically speaking, it has no influence on the other. You could believe that you have the truth about something, even if people have a different version of it. And from small scale to large scale things. He brought up the absoluteness when it comes to ice melting and fire being hot. Now, think about ice melting and water boiling and stuff like that. At the absolute truth of 100 degrees Celsius, that depends on sea level, atmospheric pressures and stuff like that. So even that kind of a thing, but still an absolute once you've accounted for all the variables. So you're in Denver versus being in Texas, water may not boil at the same temperature. Now, before they may have discovered pressures and sea levels and stuff like that, somebody would have saw two different temperatures boil in the water. But there was unaccounted for variables out there. In the same way in conversation, you may be communicating with somebody going, you don't know that for sure, that's your opinion. It may be unknown variables that you're not aware of, that once you became aware of, you realize, okay, that is the absolute truth. It may have to do with your ability to understand mathematics, your ability to understand philosophy or logic and how to think critically. Sometimes you're in conversation with somebody like, you can't prove that. And then you prove it to them and they're like, oh, wow, I didn't know. It's because there was these unknown pockets of knowledge that they didn't have access to in the moment. They weren't aware of it. That's why we encourage epistemology on here so much. You got something you want to put on there?
Yeah, James Ward commented on this video. He said, as a child has to be taught to believe in God. No one is born with the concept of God. Any thoughts on that?
I'd say this, whether that's true or not, that's a separate point, and I don't mind getting into that one. But again, this is a show about logic and reason. A child has to be taught to believe in God. No one is born with the concept of God. That's irrelevant. A child has to be taught about mathematics. A child has to be taught what his parents' names are. You're not born knowing your parents' name. Again, that has nothing to do with whether something is true or false. That's not an epistemology. Just because you're born knowing or not knowing something has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of that particular claim. And people need to understand that. I don't hope that, did you catch that? I don't know if I said it too fast for people, because I talk fast sometimes, but is what I'm saying making sense to you?
Say it again for me and the audience.
So it says a child has to be taught to believe in God. No one is born with the concept of God. This is some type of attack on the belief in God, I presume. And I mentioned I can go about this two different ways. Whether or not children understand God without being taught about God, right? That's one question. But I want to focus on this as a disproof of the concept of God. And what I would say to that is that just because a child is not born knowing something doesn't mean that which they do not know is false. So I gave the example of mathematics, algebra. Are babies born knowing algebra?
Okay. No.
Does that make algebra false? Does that make the concept, to kind of use the exact wording, does that make the concept of algebra false? Of course not. Are they born with the concept of their parents' names? Were you and I born knowing our parents' names? No, but that doesn't mean that our parents' names are false, or that's not our parents' names. Just because you're born or not
The
born.
first name was Mama and Dada. That was the first name.
First names. Interesting thing. You ever heard the Chuck Norris? It says that Chuck Norris was born in a log cabin that he built with his own hands.
Shout out to Chuck.
Yeah, we're not born. Perhaps we're not born with the concept of God. But now I want to address the other side of that. Is that I can't think of the philosopher and communicator of this, but you have the watch situation, the watchman, the watchmaker. There's a good case to be made that people look at. I remember Ari Spears was talking about, I don't know if we're going to cover that or we covered it on the last show. I'm talking too fast, but Ari Spears talks about how he's pretty much an atheist now because of all the ugly stuff that he sees with religious people historically and now, from slavery all the way to now. But he said on the flip side of that, what happens is whenever I'm looking at the expanse of the universe, I'm like, I feel like there's a God. God is all around the world. All different kind of cultures have a concept of God. Where does that come from?
Yeah.
And I don't want to get that's a more potent point than people probably realize. Like alliteration right there. Potent point, people realize. But yeah, so people may not really understand the potency of that all the way, but you got to explain how almost every single civilization that has ever lived has had some kind of concept of God. Were they all at the same school? No, they all lived at different points in history, spoke different languages. So there is something universal and absolute about the concept of God. Now, the other point about that is that when a lot of people, when they look at the universe and stuff, so I guess I'll just say the age-old apologetic about the proof of God, which is the watchmaker. If you were to walk through a beach and obviously you're seeing some sand, you're seeing the tides come in and out, and then you saw a watch on the ground, you wouldn't think, oh, wow, the nature has somehow constructed this apparatus that's able to tell time naturally. Nobody would think that. They would be like, somebody designed this. When people look at the universe, they look at the sunrise and all the different things like that, it cries that this is all designed. It's so uniform. When you look at your own body, you're thinking like, oh, wow, this works so well. This is not by random chance. This was designed. So there's a good case to be made that way. But you could take it either way. But the thing is, it's not a good point. My point is that comment, although it may be common sense to some people, is not a good point.
Okay.
So